So thank you all for coming. It's an enormous pleasure to have a chance to have this film here, this remarkable film, and it seems to me, a salient moment in the development of a cross between politics and film that not only registers in the film world, but also, I hope very much and expect, will have resonance in the political dimension as well. With us today are the heroes of this making of this film. Diane Wireman, who runs Participant, has shepherded an enormous number of important documentary films over a very long period of time and has made a tremendous impact through her efforts throughout the film world, including Sundance and elsewhere, and is somebody who's guided this kind of effort for some time, and I hope for a very long time into the future. Lawrence Benders, producer of this film, known to you, I'm sure, through *Inglourious Basterds* and many other remarkable films that he's produced over the years. This film has both the political smarts and the aesthetic impact that I think will give it a tremendous range throughout all the places that I'm sure it will be seen. Valerie Plame has been a figure in the public eye for some time, and out of the public eye for some time before that. Her work in trying to detect and counter the proliferation of nuclear weapons is among the most important political tasks that we entrust to the intelligence establishment and have for some time, and the multiplicity of ways in which she's tried to stop that proliferation is something for which we owe her a great debt. My colleague, Graham Allison, has occupied roles from running the Kennedy School to his role in government over many years. And most recently, and perhaps most proximately to the task at hand here, his books and articles and speeches about the need to control the distribution of fissile material is become really a goal that we now see being discussed all the way up to the White House. And I think that this is the combination of our participants tonight gives us a chance to discuss these issues in great depth, both from the filmmaking perspective, from the intersection of film and politics, and from what should be one of the great political items on our agenda for the coming years. What I thought we'd do is to take the next 35 minutes or so to have a chance to have a discussion among the panelists about the film, about the politics of the film, about the making of the film, to open this question up to some of its many dimensions, and then to have a chance in the final 20 minutes of this hour, we'll finish about 1 o'clock, to have questions from all of you and take advantage of this chance to talk to this remarkable assembly of people in their political and artistic representations. So let me begin by asking a question that has 2 parts. The first is, I'd like to ask so if we divide the panel very roughly into the political section, should I say on my left, and then to the questions of filmmaking and the role of documentary, and then we'll mix it all up and have a discussion. But the film ends with, it's woven through the film, but then in a concentrated way at the end of the film come some injunctions to us all for how we what is there concretely to do once we've taken on board the enormous danger of these thousands of tons of fissile material that are floating around in the world, sometimes in very dangerously unprotected environments. And how do we counter the twin dangers of proliferation to states and of extension of nuclear materials and weapons to groups of terrorists? So let me begin by starting with you, Graham. As you have thought about these problems, and as you see the concentration of towards the end of the film in what we might do, could you sort of in brief sort of say something about how you think you know, if this film has the impact that I think all of us hope it does, and we were to push our politicians towards a more, you know, an active stance in trying to counter this threat, where are the priorities?
Well, let me start by saying congratulations to Lawrence and Diane. I had never seen the film screened before. And I remember after Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, saying to Al, who was a student in the first class I ever taught here at Harvard, that's exaggerating slightly, I was the section man, and he was a couple of years younger, but a sophomore, I never could have imagined an inconvenient truth. I mean, just in all my imagination, it was not. And I would say the notion that these folks have done it again for something so important is just extremely to be admired. So I'm awed a bit. Okay. Now, with respect to the question, I think as Lawrence already said at the introduction, in introducing the film, we're in the midst of a pretty amazing set of events. And if you haven't been watching the funny papers, it's probably worth just remembering what Lawrence said. I mean, in Washington on Monday and Tuesday, for the first time since 1945, in the largest gathering a president ever assembled, and the last time he did it, we created the UN. So that's a pretty big deal. Okay? Obama, with all the other things on his agenda, brought together 46 heads of state for just one topic. And people kept saying, oh, well, you know, there's a lot of other things, okay? And some people said, well, you know, the economic crisis is not over, the financial regulation is not over, we didn't get climate change done yet. What about this? No, he said, we're gonna have a nuclear security summit. Okay? And then when they were gonna have a nuclear security summit, people said, but we should talk about Iran, or we should talk about disarmament, or we should he said, no, there's just one topic at this summit. Locking up all nuclear weapons and all nuclear materials to a gold standard, beyond the reach of thieves or terrorists. Wait a minute, how serious a problem is that today? So Monday night, he convened a dinner. It was only for the heads of state, no seconds, and tried to make persuasive the proposition that if terrorists get just one small nuclear bomb and exploded in one of our cities, anywhere in the world, it's going to change our civilization as we know it, and that this is a real present danger. Now, I would say mostly people regard this as esoteric. So the notion that there's a film that's helping to try to make credible, which I think the film does, that yes, there's a lot of nuclear bombs, and there's a lot of material from which people could make bombs. And making a bomb is not impossible. And there are people who are serious about getting a bomb. I mean, that whole notion was his task Monday night. I've heard from, half a dozen of the, secondhand from the people who were there. I would say he's an extremely effective professor, okay, in doing his thing. Probably half thought, well, if he thinks this is that important, probably there's something there. And by the end of the time, well, I got to think more about it. There's some that think this is a strange American preoccupation. So again, I applaud the film for it's got an international cast. It's not just this is all about America. Okay? And I think the summit was about two ideas which are come very clear in the film. First, the threat. This is a genuine threat. One nuclear bomb exploding in one city will change our world. That's a clear and present danger. Even as Obama said the other night, there's this cruel irony that, the Cold War was about nuclear weapons. That story is over. Most people would like to close that chapter and move on. But lo and behold, as the film rightly says, all these nuclear weapons and the materials from which they could be made remain. And ironically, the chance of one nuclear bomb exploding in one city, as Obama said the other night, is greater than it was during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, all this was under the supervision of one evil empire and one us. Now, there was plenty of opportunities for accidents and otherwise. So there was ways things could have gone bad, but you were not going to have somebody stealing a nuclear weapon from Pakistan, and you weren't going to have somebody like Kim Jong-il selling a bomb. So I would say the one big idea that he started with was this is a real, clear, present danger. And then the big insight that the whole summit was about, which again is exactly what the film is on target on, the people there gathered have in their power to prevent nuclear terrorism by doing just one thing. That's a pretty big thing, but just one thing. Everything locked up as good as gold in Fort Knox or treasures in the Kremlin Armory. So no fissile material, no mushroom cloud, no nuclear terrorism. I mean, it's that simple, stupid, okay? Or it's that stupid, simple. Any case, now, so to the question, what about citizens? I think, I mean, it's a rare thing to have a president this far ahead of almost all the policy community. I mean, most of his advisors regard it as very strange when he devotes this much attention to things. Again, the film was very good on, him at the Security Council back in September. People said, you're going to gather all the leaders, all the countries are there in New York in September for the big UN confab. We're going to go to Copenhagen in a few months, and the subject of an inconvenient truth is at risk. He said, I'm going to talk about nuclear danger. They said, people are not interested in nuclear danger. He said, I'm the chair of the meeting, that's the subject, okay, we're going to talk about it. And he did. So I would say we have a rare occasion where a president has got it, in my view. And then the question of what citizens can do behind. If the START agreement that was signed, as Lawrence said at the beginning, in Prague last week, gets bogged up in the politics of the dysfunctionality of Washington, a lot of momentum that should be imparted to the agenda that we're talking about here will be dissipated. Well, that's nuts, okay? So members, congressmen, and senators who are going to be on the line should be hearing from their constituents and from people like us. Look, we understand that there's a big fuss between Republicans and Democrats, and we understand there's a lot of other stuff going on. But one nuclear bomb in your city, is going to change our lives.
Yeah, and I think that seems to me one of the messages of the film is that nuclear weapons are not like other weapons, and that as fearful as we are of binary chemical weapons or biological weapons and anthrax, I mean, there are a lot of nasty things in the world, but in the end, there's one weapon of mass destruction. There's one weapon that's of this scale.
But one single act could kill hundreds of thousands of people. Now, there's the terrible, many, many other things that can happen terribly. And as Gore likes to tease, climate change could change our world and will change our world if we fail to act on it. In a few decades, this could change our world right now.
Valerie, Plame, let me ask you a question to follow up on that, which is one of the things in the film that struck me as really astonishing were these interviews with the fissile material thieves. I mean, I had no picture. I mean, we've all seen pictures of nuclear explosions before, and it's always shocking to see them. But I had no faces ever associated with this. And you've spent a good deal of your career trying to stop these sorts of bad actors from getting their hands on and moving around this fissile material. Are there things that we should be thinking about politically in terms of how the intelligence agencies, not just of the United States, but elsewhere, deal with this? It was quite shocking in the film to see this comment that when we've come across this material, it's almost always been by accident. We were looking for X and we found some enhanced U-235, or we were looking for Y and we happened to come across some plutonium. But Are we doing what we can in a policy way to try to combat? I mean, aside from gathering up and Fort Knoxing to mangle the English language, to put into Fort Knox the fissile material, are there other things that we should be doing to try to stop this?
I love the line in the film where after the fellow who was a car thief or car battery thief, and he got caught up in that ring, he said, imagine if you had someone with an ideology and with a brain to do this. You know, what could actually, it gets a little laugh in the audience, but these are petty thieves. And for my money, it's the former Soviet republics where it is the most volatile and dangerous region that these sort of thefts happen. The film does an excellent job of making it very clear that potatoes are guarded better than highly enriched uranium. I worked as a covert operations officer, working on counterproliferation issues, and it's been, for me personally, such an honor and a delight to be able to work on a project that is able to use my expertise in another way. I will say, when I was in the thick of things and working in operations with the agency, as it should be, you're very much involved in the day-to-day activities, you know, following the thread and how the procurement network, how that plays out. But what I've had a personal evolution. When I was doing that work, and sometimes you didn't even know it was a victory, but you put your damnedest into it, and you would just hope that you would maybe stop a shipment or find out where something was going to, or that there's all sorts of things, covert action you can take. But ultimately, that was only about delaying the programs. You were just trying to buy a little bit more time. And what I find amazing about this film is when the idea was first germinated was 2 years ago. Obama was not the president. This was not an issue that anyone spoke about. Those of us in the intelligence community that were working on this were doing it because we thought it was satisfying. You could say you did something at the end of the day. And along comes this film at an unbelievable moment in time where there's a certain momentum. For me personally, I've evolved from being so engaged professionally in delay to wait a minute. That's not the answer. You need to go further than that, because we've always been in the structure of the bipolar world. And as Graham was saying, everything was locked down, and there was a certain structure to that, and there was a reason for I love that MAD acronym, mutually assured destruction, but it worked. But the world has changed drastically. There's emergent threats, and we're now at the point where the proliferation of weapons actually weakens the strong nations, the nuclear nations. And so for me, I've come now to the point where the only way that you have to have, I think you have to have an objective of, we are going to get to zero. And I am so in awe of President Obama having, as you say, being so far out of ahead of the policy community. That typically isn't how Washington works. You know, there are think tanks and people chattering, and it sort of builds, and then it finally gets to the president and he does something. He, as a candidate, laid this out. And I don't know how much you were following his campaign at the time, that Lawrence and participant, Diane, they wanted to make this film. But we're at this convergence, and what an amazing confluence of events. And finally, just to say, to add to what Graham was saying, this, like the whole issue of the inconvenient truth, global warming, as an individual, it's overwhelming and it's intimidating. And you go, oh, I'm so depressed, what can I possibly do? I'm an individual. Well, I think the film does a good job at the end of wrapping that up and saying there are ways as an individual that you can become engaged. I know we'll speak more about that, but it's not a hopeless situation. And there is an objective to move toward.
Good, thank you. Lawrence, when you, I mean, you've had a career that's embraced both very influential films and on the other side also been a political activist for some time. Can you say a little bit about how you came to try to combine these in this film, but how this film came about and what you know, what are the elements that went into deciding to make it the way you did? Some of the aesthetic choices, for instance, that you made in its structure.
Sure. There's a couple of questions. So the way the movie came about. Is this too loud? Feels like no, fine. Okay. The way the movie came about was I don't know. It feels like it was more than 2 years now. Maybe was it 3 years ago?
3 years. Yeah.
It was 3 years ago. A couple things happened. Jeff Skull, who is the owner of Participant Media, was thinking about this subject, and we were talking about it a little bit. We all became friends, Diane, myself, and Jeff, and others at Participant Media, because we made an Inconvenient Truth together, and you know, it was just such a bonding experience. And also, kind of coincidentally, at the same time, a group called Global Zero, WSI, right, is their title, but there's a Global Zero group, called me. I was getting a lot of personal phone calls, as Diane was after An Inconvenient Truth, about people with different subjects, and I'm not a documentary filmmaker, but I just happened to take on a couple, and but I've been getting phone calls from people saying, you know, what about this subject? What about this subject? You did An Inconvenient Truth. Can you do it with this subject? And the reason why this one stuck with me was simply, you know, there's only a few things that could just completely destroy the world and humanity forever. And this is one of them. And I felt like with my personally limited time, what could I do? What's the biggest difference I can make with my limited bandwidth, I guess? And so between the Global Zero folks and Jeff and Participant Media and Diane, we came together. And Diane is the goddess of all documentaries made. I'll just say that so we spent a lot of time because, okay, you have an idea. As I said, you know, the idea is to make a documentary, to activate, to motivate, to create a movement. It's not just to make a documentary on its own, which is also fine. But so, okay, we have an idea. We're going to make a documentary about okay, now you have to make that into a story. Like what's going to create what's the beginning, middle, end? What's the narrative? What's going to want to make you care? Because otherwise, you could be a good 60 minutes piece or a piece on 2020, what have you, and all fine things. But what makes it a theatrical experience where millions of people are going to see? So that's where Diane comes in. And we spent 6 months really going back and forth, trying to figure this out, not really knowing if we had a movie yet, honestly, and trying to figure out how to make it into a movie and what's going to be the structure and how do we really. And that's a lot of creative, just brain work that really having no idea if you're going to get to where you want to get to. You really don't. And we got there. And from there, then we went ahead and made the movie. I mean, there's a lot more to talk about, but maybe I could just leave it.
So I mean, are there ways in which the experience of crafting stories in a theatrical fiction rather than nonfiction environment shaped the kind of the way that you clearly it's not just a white paper report on, you know, the 6 lessons. It's really, it does have a structure and a story, and you weave the characters in and out in obviously a very deliberate way, and you use you make choices from the opening backwards explosion all the way through that are aesthetic as well as repertorial.
Right.
Can you say something about the way that you thought about the structure or came to think about the structure of the film?
Well, it's really interesting because making a documentary, you rarely end up with what you start with. And I think the rare exception of that was An Inconvenient Truth, where, you know, Al Gore had a slideshow. He had 360 slides. I think the movie ended up with 250, but there was a structure. And we went in thinking, we're going to make the structure a little bit of his life, which would be the emotional part, and the slideshow. But it was still an incredibly difficult process to get the balance. And what seems like a simple movie was quite difficult to get that balance and to make it work. With this, we had an idea in the beginning, and
Which isn't in at all.
which is not in it. Yeah, exactly. He's not in it at all. And there are things like, you know, it's such a difficult. It's so hard to make these things. I'll just tell you, like 2 months before we locked the movie, we were like, oh, we don't have a movie, and we want to get into Sundance, and we screened it for some people, and it felt very episodic, meaning there are lots of things in the movie and nothing strung together. And so we're hitting our heads against the wall. And there's a lot of good stuff in the movie. So, okay.
The Kennedy material, the Kennedy speech, which is, I think, brilliant. It was the idea of one of our editors, actually. A brilliant idea to structure and to lead us through and to sort of set up the major, madness, accidents, miscalculation. That was an element of the film that came in very, very late. Just an example of how documentary filmmaking is constantly shifting a lot. Also, of course, happens in the edit room where you have to find the story. You have to, we had 80 interviews. A lot of the people who were interviewed in the film are not in the film, but a wealth of material. Lucy Walker, who directed the film, talked with a lot of people. And so we had this sort of rich material from incredible interviewees, but of course the list of interviews doesn't make a film. And so then to create a compelling story around each of these threats required, massive archival research, some creative elements, the graphics in the film, the music in the film, all of these creative elements which really develop as the film is in post-production, and you find a story through that process, come hook or crook. We just kept working at it. And one of the things we realized when we started screening it as a work in progress, and I actually will give some a shout out to Caroline Labreska, who's here, who saw a screening as a work in progress, that there was a real sense that people wanted to know that there could be something done about this, because at one point, we have that aftermath section, which is so critical because we think it's really important that people understand on a very concrete level what will happen. This is not theoretical. We're not just looking at the past. This would happen to your city, to you personally. And, it's a very powerful scene. And then Oppenheimer, the I am death speech at the end, that line that he's giving, again, just heart-wrenching, really the emotional climax of the film. And for a while we thought, well, that's the film. That's the, where can you go from there? And we realized that we needed to come out of that into the space that we're all here really to engage in, which is, here's what we can do. We actually can deal with this on a policy level, internationally, globally. It requires the cooperation of leaders around the world. And so that last 10 minutes of the film, where people are very concretely talking about containing the materials, taking missiles off of hair trigger, the different very, very concrete verification that Secretary Baker talks about. There are very concrete things that can happen at the policy level. At the individual level, what we realized was people have to, A, be aware of the issue, which is why we made the movie. Because when we made it, as everyone has said, this was not in the public arena at all. No one was talking about it. And we started it before Obama was elected president. We had no idea that this would be coming out at this time. Thank God, because timing, you need a really terrific film, but you also need timing working for you when it comes out. We now have that momentum. And I think what we were wanting the film to do, and what Participant really tries to do with all of our films, whether they're documentaries or narratives, although I think they're very, docs sort of work in tandem with our mission, which is to create films that will hopefully be entertaining and people will see, but will also inspire social change. That seeing the movie and becoming aware of the danger, becoming aware of the reality that we're living with, was the first step. And then the second step is to inspire people when they see it to feel like they want to be part of the solution, to create a movement. You know, at the very end, you see sort of in fact, Ambassador Burt talks about public opinion having a strong impact on the START negotiations in the past. The public opinion, the public will, public involvement, public engagement is absolutely key. And you use that to leverage political will.
Yes.
That's how we do it. And so even Joe, when he talks about Kennedy, if I had known that this was so popular, I would have done it a lot sooner. Really hoping that people will want to get involved, become part of, you know, when we say demand zero at the end, and there's a text number, if you text to that number, you'll go and find a lot more about the Global Zero movement, which is really a 20-year plan, when nobody is sitting here with rosy-colored glasses that we can go to zero tomorrow. And it isn't the kind of film or issue that we have with An Inconvenient Truth where we could say, change a light bulb, and you'll feel, even in changing a light bulb, that you're doing something. This you can't change a light bulb, but this you can say, I don't want to live in this kind of world. I want to be involved. I think we need to go to zero. And there are ways that I can get involved personally, and there are ways that I can leverage my voice as a citizen with my political leaders to demand that as well. So that's very, very much a key of ultimately where we came out with the film after this process of, you know, literally it was about 3 years from when we started.
You know, one thing that strikes me is that the film resonates so well with what you couldn't have anticipated was that Kennedy, who, as you mentioned, is woven through the film, and I don't know whether 3 or 4 times comes up before it kind of develops at the end, and I thought it's rather beautiful. But Kennedy had this famous experience where he was briefed on, you have your choice. Do you want to exclude the major cities of Eastern Europe, or do you want to concentrate all your weapons in the 100 top cities in Russia, in the Soviet Union itself? And there was a shock, and he turned and said, are we human? I mean, what are we doing? And I think Obama had a similar moment a couple of months into, that we've read about where a couple of months into the administration was given the briefing, realized that sort of how much had been left over from the Cold War all these years, 20 years later. And I think it was a rather shocking political moral event for him, even though he'd been committed to this for a long time. And that resonance, the fact that even the presidents of the United States over half a century are brought up short by the reality of the extent of what this means, echoes the individual shock that we have in confronting the issue as you begin to develop it in the film and spread it more widely, and that maybe that this could have a really widespread impact. One thing that I'd like to ask you, that struck me from the film, to any of you, all of you, is these scenes early in the film of the jubilation as each successive country gets nuclear weapons. The British officials and soldiers in their khaki shorts, all the way through, the parading in the streets with papier-mâché rockets or whatever. I mean, the kind of, in Pakistan, and each country has come to see having the possession of nuclear weapons as an enormous mark of modernity, of power, of sitting with the big boys at the table. And we've constructed a world system, from the Security Council on down, that puts us in a terrible bind, where we're saying to the people of the world, those who have nuclear power are the deciders of the fate of the planet. They are the countries of modernity and authority. They have the moral authority to make decisions about the rest of the world. And then we say, and by the way, don't get nuclear weapons. And that's very hard. And when you see these countries, not just Pakistan, but England as well, in that moment, or the Soviet Union, or North Korea. I mean, each of these countries, it's been a source of somehow affirming their place in the true firmament of world authority. And I wonder if having worked through this film and thought about these issues for such a long time, whether any of you have ideas about how to dislodge, how to make the possession of nuclear weapons not the symbol, the token of moral authority in the world. Because it seems to me, as long as we keep reinforcing this idea that those who have it are truly modern and truly authoritative, it's hard to say to people, we'll keep them and maybe you won't have them because we really sort of like that.
But let me just say one thing, and I'm just curious, is that as we have this group, the Global Zero group, we created a conference in Paris. It's the second year now. We had it in February. And we had about 200 people, some former heads of states, President Padilla, Harry Robinson, and we had a lot of amazing people. There's some generals and people, heads of senates in different countries. But we had some really interesting Pakistanis and Indians. So we had this gentleman, the Chief Air Marshal Tyagi, who ran the Air Force in India, which basically is most of their nuclear missiles are on airplanes or jets. So he pretty much ran the Air Force. And then there was a general there who was in charge of all nuclear weapons. They're a phenomenal group of people, and the same on the Pakistani side. And these are all ex now. They are no longer running it. But they spent their days facing off at each other, about 25 on each side, and they were all at this Global Zero conference. And they spent their lives figuring out how to either defend or make an offense on the other. And at this conference, a lot of people spoke, and it was fantastic and amazing to hear, I'm forgetting his name, the general in charge of the entire arsenal of India in 1998, say in 1998, I felt it was in India's national security interest to have the bomb, and 10 years later, I think it's our national security interest not to have the bomb. And that was, these are not lefty peaceniks. These are people who are, hardened men. It was mainly men, as Queen Noor said several times. A lot of white guys in suits here, and we're the women. But there are these very strong guys who had a change of heart, and they're in charge of these arsenals. So I think that there's a lot of hope, because these are part of this whole group. There's national security advisors. It's a lot of important people, a lot of conservatives who very much believe that it is in the world's interest that, as everyone's been saying, that the Cold War deterrence is no longer the thing. And so, yes, you have to weigh deterrence and the pride of having the bomb is becoming a bit of a relic. And although there are a lot of people holding on to that, there could be a generational shift. There's a financial implication. There's $1.4 trillion a year is spent on the nuclear weapons of the world. That's, if you divide that by roughly 7 billion, that's $200 a person a year. If you can imagine how much money is spent on food, on people who don't have food and water. United States, 45% of the money is spent by the U.S. alone. So there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of inertia holding on, but I think the inertia is heading the other way.
But Peter, I think you put your finger on two extremely important points that we need to underline here. It is the case that each state, as it has gotten nuclear weapons, has celebrated a huge technological achievement. And that's a fact. We can't erase that history. On Iranian money, they have their nuclear symbol. So this is not just for Ahmadinejad. All Iranians think this. They're proud of the fact that this is a sign of their advanced technology, modernity, and others. So, and lo and behold, lots of the clubs in the world sort of seem to include the haves and not the have-nots. Actually, it was quite interesting for this summit that just occurred in Washington that I mentioned. They had 46 heads of state, including a number like South Africa, who made nuclear weapons and eliminated their nuclear weapons, and the event celebrated that, to try to address this question. So I'd say there's a big problem there that we're not going to get over quickly. Okay? But I think the suggestion about people's minds change over time, but we should also think about what else needs to change in terms of status, symbols, signs of, so for example, with the case of Iran, if they should be proud of advanced new technologies for energy, which are many of them hugely more advanced and complicated than having a nuclear bomb, that would be we might put it in a space. The second thing is there's this security dimension of things that, or of the issues, that again is one of the obstacles that have to be addressed in this agenda. If you were a North Korean and you thought, President Bush announced there was an axis of evil, and there were three bad hombres, and they were North Korea, Iraq, and Iran. And at the time, we might have had 2 bombs worth of plutonium. Well, he then toppled the guy who had certifiably no nuclear weapons and gave a pass to the one who did. I'm thinking this is kind of an insurance policy of some sort. So the security dimension of this issue, as one works on the nuclear danger, has to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. So for the Pakistanis today, as they look at an overwhelming Indian conventional superiority, they're thinking of their nuclear weapons as their equalizer, so-called. So there's I think that while recognizing that nuclear weapons are different completely than any other thing and create dangers that are unacceptable, one's got to then say, okay, so what are the motivations that might lead a nation to want weapons or to keep weapons, and how are we going to address those? Because if we fail to address those, we're not going to create the circumstances in which it'll be realistic to imagine, say, for example, Pakistan reducing its nuclear arsenal as opposed to increasing it, which is what is going on now.
Diane, I just wanted to ask you one question before we open up to the participants here. And that is, one of the remarkable things that you've been able to do here in other films is to extend the reach of documentary films and to really try to figure out how to have them broaden their avenues of circulation. And I mean, part of it is having terrific films, and there's no doubt about that. And part of it is a broader expansion of that's happened more widely in the way that film is paid attention to. But I mean, thinking back over the last years, what are some of the elements that have made it possible, or how are you thinking about the distribution and impact of documentary films in a way that goes beyond the more specialized audiences, or there was a sort of an important but restricted role of the sort of white paper television report, and this is not what you're doing. I mean, you're doing something more than that. And how have you thought over these last years about the way that theatrical nonfiction can function?
It's always a challenge. I mean, it remains a challenge. If anything, the distribution options have constricted rather than expanded over the past 5 years. But obviously it starts with a really compelling film, which is compelling storytelling, and I think emotional resonance. Something that goes beyond in that sense, goes beyond a news story or a magazine show. You start with a journey, taking the audience to a place that possibly they haven't been, and employing the creative elements of storytelling that are often used in narrative filmmaking. I mean, I don't really distinguish that much when it comes creatively to what makes a film powerful, for people that might work in a theatrical setting. And starts there. I think it's a challenge to find those particular subjects, stories, characters that also have sort of a broad appeal. But when you find them and get them and work with a really talented team, because it's an incredibly collaborative medium, as many of you know, it requires a lot to kind of come together. So when you are able to, it's sort of come up with this bit of magic, you know, it's like you don't ever know when you start, as we were saying, particularly, you know, say with this film, we started here and we ended here, you know, but we followed a thread. It all was consistent. It wasn't like we were lost. It's just that's how the process is. It takes you into sort of territory that you don't expect, and that's what I love about documentary filmmaking. That's one of the big draws for me. That it is a journey, and even the filmmakers go on a journey to find the story and to create something that hopefully will have that type of larger resonance. Then you have to get it out. So now you have this amazing film and you've premiered at Sundance and you don't have a distributor and you are really wanting this movie to reach as many people as it can possibly reach because you've made it in part because you want to affect change. So it's like, you know, there's this tremendous pressure to find an avenue to get this movie out. And our plan with a participant is, if possible, we initially go with the theatrical route. Not because we expect massive numbers of people to see it. Obviously, far more people see documentaries on television in terms of eyeballs. But what can happen if you have a successful theatrically released film is the film and the issue can get into the public consciousness and into the culture in a way that I would argue a television broadcast alone doesn't do. So if we had taken An Inconvenient Truth and put it immediately on PBS, people would have seen it and it would have been what it would have been, but it never would have become what it became. That was largely because of the theatrical distribution and the attention, not only for film or entertainment pages, but op-ed pages, people writing around the issue, major news broadcasts, people just took note.
And the way we did that is, and what we're doing with this movie, is we built a broad coalition. But by the time An Inconvenient Truth came out, there were about 2 billion eyeballs were on the subject and the movie before it was released in the 2 theaters in LA and the 2 theaters in New York. So it was all the internet gurus, it was Google. At that point, MySpace was like zooming up. MySpace we had 1 billion eyeballs alone from MySpace, YouTube, Yahoo, eBay, and on and on. I mean, and that came from out of the TED conference. And then we went to Cannes. And then all the NGOs, 1 minute to go for Q&A. And then all the NGOs got involved, all the environmental groups and religious groups. And the same thing, we're doing the same exact thing with this movie, is that we're building a massive coalition. And it's even more important with this movie because there's a ratification that's coming up. And so hopefully that's going to happen in July when the movie comes out. So by the time this movie comes out, if we've done our job, then there's going to be a lot going on around this movie that people go, where did this come from? I just want to say that.
Great. So Lawrence, say another word about that. How does that work and how does that relate to us? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would encourage everybody here to text 77177 and write the word zero, Z-E-R-O. Or you can go to and sign the Global Zero Declaration. That's the one thing everyone should just do if you've been moved and motivated by the movie. That's number one, but I would encourage everyone here to get involved. We could talk more about how to get involved maybe during the Q&A, but we will be doing grassroots movements. We have a college. We have 4 vans going around the country with college students promoting the movie. People involved with NGOs here, mailing lists. We go through a lot of different things. Definitely sign the Global Zero Declaration. Last week alone, 200,000 people worldwide signed it. This is not just from, well, it's just a large group of people signing the petition. And I'll talk more about that.
Good. So I'd like now to open up discussion to the audience, and we have a roving microphone. Is that how we're going to? Okay. So, yeah, I guess please come up, and if you want to speak, why don't you just line up behind here, and we'll.
Bruce Jackson. Fantastic film, by the way. When you did the research for this film, I'm curious, when you look at something like, nuclear proliferation, it's such a strategic advantage and has been for so many years. Have you found any other technologies or in the history of science that suggests that when cultures get something of strategic advantage that they're willing and can give it up in small ways? Or I don't know if anything like that showed up to have some precedent to what's possible to get to zero. So anyway, that's the question.
I think that's a question for a historian of science.
Well, one thing in the film that I very much appreciated was the remarks about poison gas, and and the fact that we have examples, whether they're dum-dum bullets or poison gas or other things, where people have made the transformation to thinking of them as repellent even within the sphere of war. And as oxymoronic as it can sound, we do have rules of war. And if we can make it so that nuclear weapons are considered like harboring the mustard gas, that would be a great accomplishment. That is to say, they can be of momentary advantage, or even more than momentary advantage, but we've come to something, a more than individual accord to not use that. Now, that doesn't guarantee that every extremist is going to subscribe to the rules of war, but it may be a key element in getting international accords to restrict and confine the distribution of nuclear weapons and the materials that go into them.
And I would add that this is a moment in time when the United States, despite perhaps disillusionment over the last few years in our leadership, that we can provide this, be out in front. To be able to say this, the bit in the movie about South Africa and how they said, we are going to join rational nations and give this up. We are in a different world than when the first bomb was exploded in the New Mexico desert. So it is a moment in time to be seized.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about nuclear energy and whether it's possible to move towards global zero while also using the same raw materials. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that nuclear energy uses the same raw materials as nuclear weapons, and whether it's possible to move towards global zero while also having the option to use those materials for energy.
It's a good question. It's a long topic, but the answer is yes. Okay, to be clear, a nuclear power plant like at Pilgrim here in New Hampshire or Seabrook in Massachusetts uses 4% enriched uranium. There's nothing that can happen at that power plant that would be the explosion of a mushroom cloud. So there's essentially no risk of a nuclear terrorist or nuclear bomb exploding at one of those facilities. As the film rightly says, the same factory that makes 4% enriched uranium, those centrifuges, if they just keep spinning, can spin to 90% uranium. And 90% uranium you can make a bomb from. So the issue is the fuel cycle, in effect, that is the making of the fuel and the disposal of the sent fuel, not the reactor itself. And as the film said, one of the proposals that's out there now, and that I think is an extremely good proposal, is that this fuel cycle be internationalized so that states can have confidence that nobody's diverting anything that, from a perfectly legitimate civilian fuel cycle to the additional activity that would make a nuclear bomb.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi. Congratulations on the film. It seems that at the core, one of the core issues is human nature. And like gun control, some people might possess a gun for defense. Other people might possess it because they want to cause harm on it. by eliminating such a weapon of mass destruction, obviously we're eliminating the amount of damage anybody of ill will could do. Are there other issues that we can approach to, let's say, some of the rogue terrorist groups and stuff to affect maybe at the core the motivation of why one would want to even exercise that? Thank God no one has offensively used one of these yet on the nations that possess it, but what happens ultimately when the day a smaller group could actually, if not just acquire it, even generate that material? How do you access, how do you influence, if you will, these large organizations or these smaller organizations at the core of just intent and what they would want to do with it? Because I could understand why Pakistan, for example, would not want to give up it. And even if you get down to ground zero, and forgive me for weaving in a few questions, even if you get down to ground zero, what's to prevent it from just proliferating again if India did something in the eyes of Pakistan that was a major threat to them?
Anyone want to take that? Valerie?
I'll just start by saying our first and most immediate impact can only be on nation states. That influence, what influence do we possibly, or very little, that we have on non-state actors? And that's a large portion of the film, of course. And the answer to that is getting to the end where you first get in the community of nations and you are locking down, you're verifying, and it's just making it extremely difficult and ultimately impossible to find even enough weapons-grade material to make a dirty bomb, which would have just as a devastating impact psychologically if it were set off in any city in the world. I think it was General Tommy Franks who said that, of course, as we said earlier, a lot of bad things in the world, but there's something about a nuclear explosion that is society-altering. So, I mean, to the heart of your question is humankind and how we approach motivations, incentives, carrots and sticks. The first place to start, these terrorist groups, which have a nihilistic view of the world, hard to change that, but you can start with the community nations and policy and working toward that, at least to make it impossible for them to get their hands on it. I mean, that's just a more practical view rather than trying to change human nature.
Let me just do one line on it, because again, I think it goes back to this summit that was held in Washington this week. We can prevent terrorists conducting a nuclear terrorist attack by doing just one thing: denying them the means for their deadliest aspirations. There'll still be people that have deadly aspirations, and that's a problem too, and we should work on that. And actually, if they can't get a nuclear bomb, as with a gun, they might do something else, with a knife or with a stick. But in any case, the one thing that they could do that would kill hundreds of thousands of people in a single blow, we can deny them the means for doing.
In a film that clearly has message, the messenger is very important as well. And that's something that we as filmmakers and social change agents are always concerned about, is how do we make the selection of the messenger. Graham and Valerie, it's clear why you are messengers in this film. Lawrence, I'm curious about McNamara as a messenger. I'm curious about those that did come into the film who didn't make it, who are other leaders. Certainly McNamara, I think, is a discredited messenger, and it seems like the strength of your film actually has to do with the fact that we don't want to shoot the messenger. So I'm curious about that whole process of thinking about how you create films where the messenger is as strong as the message.
Well, yeah, we probably have 50 people who are not in the movie that we interviewed. I think we just felt McNamara was, historically important person to have in the movie. It was important for us to have, for instance, Secretary James Baker is in the movie, Ambassador Richard Burt, who was obviously conservative and someone who was chief arms negotiator in the START Treaty. We wanted to have heads of states in there, people who actually had, their finger was the last person to make the ultimate decision and who had that ultimate responsibility. So I felt like I think together we created a blend of people that in creating the story. I mean, we had some pretty extraordinary people that are not in the movie.
And McNamara also, I mean, he's an example of someone who I think, who came to realize that we need to get rid of all of these. I mean, it was the last interview, I believe, the last interview that was conducted with McNamara before he died.
A couple months later.
And the fact that he, through his lifetime and experience, came to that conclusion and was very passionate about destroying nuclear weapons is somehow moving. I mean, in spite of what he did when he was obviously working in office. We also, it made sense because we were coming out of Kennedy, and there was just the connection there. Again, creatively, there was a connection to come into McNamara. But I think that more than anything, the fact that there were these leaders who were in positions of power who one would think would be advocates of holding on to power, and having the nuclear weapons is power, which is why it becomes a nation-state issue. And that he, in the last days of his life, in the last years, became such a passionate proponent for the elimination. For me, he's quite a powerful messenger, actually.
Let me say one. Go ahead.
I think on the credibility of the messenger point, the piece of it that I think is the most credible for giving it the balance is Reagan, because if the mission is zero, there's never been a president or a global leader who was so personally committed to that objective. And I think, especially since there's always a risk that the film seem like a Democrat film or people that are of a left persuasion or otherwise, Reagan is about as iconic as you can have for a balance.
I know we're going to wrap up, so I just want to make one pitch. And sort of what you were saying, asking earlier, is what we can do here for those who want to support the movie. And so as we were saying before, we're building it's starting off as a national campaign, and then it'll go to a global campaign. The movie is released July here in the United States, but then it'll be released worldwide probably in the fall. So, we encourage people to help get the word out in several ways. Just to understand how movies work. We'll release the movie in LA and New York first, and then it'll come to Boston and different cities around the country. Those two cities have to have packed, sold-out theaters. So in Inconvenient Truth, literally, Will Ferrell bought the 7 o'clock screening of the ArcLight and brought all his friends. And NRDC bought another theater and another screening. And so what we're encouraging people to do is to do exactly that. So we're looking for angels who literally will say, okay, I'm going to put down $7,000 for the 500-seat theater in this theater at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm going to give tickets to all my friends at this NGO, and that NGO will then send a newsletter out, and they'll give tickets to everybody. So there's angels. There's simply just telling your friends to go see the movie. There's people who have organizations that have magazines that have influence. Simply just going, signing the declaration to go to zero. So there's a lot that people can do in terms of making this movie work. And like in Inconvenient Truth, the more people go see the movie, the more the activation is going to happen, the more of a mobilization and a movement that occurs to build this kind of grassroots movement that creates real action, political will, as Al Gore kind of loves to say. So that I would say that is the way to energize and to help.
So from launch to lunch, I want to invite you all to to extend a real round of applause for this remarkable film.
discuss these issues in great depth, both from the filmmaking perspective, from the intersection of film and politics, and from one of what should be one of the great political items on our agenda for the coming years. What I thought we'd do is to take the next 35 minutes or so to have a chance to have a discussion among the panelists about the film, about the politics of the film, about the making of the film, to open this question up to some of its many dimensions, and then to have a chance in the final 20 minutes of this hour, we'll finish about 1 o'clock, to have questions from all of you and to take advantage of this chance to talk to this remarkable assembly of people in their political and artistic representations. So let me begin by asking a question that has 2 parts. The first is, I'd like to ask of, so if we could divide the panel very roughly into the political section, should I say on my left, and then to the questions of filmmaking and the role of documentary, and then we'll mix it all up and have a discussion. But the film ends with, I mean, it's woven through the film, but then in a concentrated way at the end of the film comes some injunctions to us all for how we might, what is there concretely to do once we've taken on board the enormous danger of these thousands of tons of fissile material that are floating around in the world, sometimes in very dangerously unprotected environments. And how do we counter the twin dangers of proliferation to states and of extension of nuclear materials and weapons to groups of terrorists? So let me begin by starting with you, Graham. As you have thought about these problems, and as you see the concentration of towards the end of the film in what we might do, could you sort of in brief sort of say something about how you think, you know, if this film has the impact that I think all of us hope it does, and we were to push our politicians towards a more, an active stance in trying to counter this threat, where are the priorities?
Well, let me start by saying congratulations to Lawrence and Diane. I had never seen the
So thank you all for coming. It's an enormous pleasure to have a chance to have this film here, this remarkable film, and it seems to me, a salient moment in the development of a cross between politics and film that not only registers in the film world, but also, I hope very much and expect, will have resonance in the political dimension as well. With us today are the heroes of this making of this film. Diane Wireman, who runs Participant, has shepherded an enormous number of important documentary films over a very long period of time, and has made a tremendous impact through her efforts throughout the film world, including Sundance and elsewhere, and is somebody who's guided this kind of effort for some time, and I hope for a very long time into the future. Lawrence Benders, producer of this film, known to you, I'm sure, through *Inglourious Basterds* and many other remarkable films that he's produced over the years. This film has both the political smarts and the aesthetic impact that I think will give it a tremendous range throughout all the places that I'm sure it will be seen. Valerie Plame has been a figure in the public eye for some time, and out of the public eye for some time before that. Her work in trying to detect and counter the proliferation of nuclear weapons is among the most important political tasks that we entrust to the intelligence establishment and have for some time, and the multiplicity of ways in which she's tried to stop that proliferation is something for which we owe her a great debt. My colleague, Graham Allison, has occupied roles from running the Kennedy School to his role in government over many years. And most recently, and perhaps most proximately to the task at hand here, his books and articles and speeches about the need to control the distribution of fissile material is become really a goal that we now see being discussed all the way up to the White House. And I think that this is the combination of our participants tonight gives us a chance to discuss.
Film screened before. And I remember after Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, saying to Al, who was a student in the first class I ever taught here at Harvard, that's exaggerating slightly, I was the section man, and he was a couple of years younger, but a sophomore, I never could have imagined an inconvenient truth. I mean, just at all my imagination, it was not, and I would say the notion that these folks have done it again for something so important is just extremely to be admired. So I'm awed a bit. Okay. Now, with respect to the question, I think as Lawrence already said at the introduction, in introducing the film, we're in the midst of a pretty amazing set of events. And if you haven't been watching the funny papers, it's probably worth just remembering what Lawrence said. I mean, in Washington on Monday and Tuesday, for the first time since 1945, in the largest gathering of